He was a homeless black man with nothing, struggling to get through each day. But when he saw a billionaire stranded on the roadside, he stepped up and offered help. No one expected what happened next. The next day, this same homeless man would experience a shocking twist of fate, one that changed his life forever. Before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you want more stories like this. As Raymond sat back down on the curb, he pulled his coat a little tighter against the chill in the air. It wasn't much of a coat, just something he'd picked up at a shelter last winter. Still, it was enough to keep the cold out, for now, anyway. His fingers brushed against the worn fabric of his backpack, his only home for the last few years. Inside, he had the basics: a change of clothes, a plastic water bottle, and a small paperback book he'd found a while back at the library donation bin. The street was quiet now. The occasional car would pass, its headlights cutting through the darkness before disappearing down the road. The noise from the city was far off, just a faint hum in the background. He liked it that way. Out here, at least, no one bothered him. He leaned back against the concrete wall behind him, staring up at the night sky. A plane passed overhead, just a tiny blinking light moving steadily across the stars. For a moment, he wondered where it was going. Somewhere warm, somewhere exciting. He hadn't been on a plane in decades. Heck, he hadn't even left this city in years. Raymond's mind wandered back to what had just happened. A billionaire, stuck in the middle of nowhere, had needed his help. He chuckled softly at the thought. If you had told him that yesterday, he would have laughed it off. But it felt good. It felt good to know he could still be useful, that he could still lend a hand. He didn't need much, just a chance to show he had something to offer. Helping people was second nature to him. Even when he had a steady job at the factory, he'd always been the guy who helped a coworker figure out a machine, or stayed late to lend a hand when someone's shift ran over. He hadn't changed much since then. The only difference now was that people didn't see him the same way. They looked at his clothes, his face, and assumed they knew his story. They didn't bother to ask. But this man tonight, this David Garrett, he had seen something in Raymond. Maybe not at first. At first, he had probably just seen an old homeless guy. But by the end of it, when Raymond handed him back a working car, it was clear that David respected what he had done. That respect felt good. It was something Raymond hadn't felt in a long time. He thought about the cash David had handed him. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it would be enough to get a hot meal tomorrow. Maybe even 2 meals if he stretched it. That alone was a blessing. Raymond sighed, his breath fogging in the cold air. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed his hands together. He wasn't expecting anything big to come of it. David Garrett would go back to his world of fancy offices, expensive cars, and important meetings. Raymond would go back to his routine, finding a place to rest, staying out of trouble, and hoping for a warmer day. Still, a small part of him couldn't help but wonder. What if tonight was the start of something different? He had no reason to believe it would be. After all, nothing had changed in years, but helping David had sparked something inside him. It wasn't hope, exactly, more like a tiny spark of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Raymond leaned back again, letting his head rest against the wall. The stars were still shining. The city's hum hadn't changed. But something felt different. Something felt possible. The next morning, Raymond woke up earlier than usual. The city was just starting to stir. The sky still dim but showing hints of daylight. His stomach growled, but that wasn't what he was thinking about. Instead, he kept wondering about the man from the night before. For the first time in a while, Raymond felt like maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. He didn't let himself dream too big. After all, life hadn't exactly been kind to him in recent years. But he couldn't shake the feeling that helping that stranded man might lead to something different. He reached into his pocket and felt the small stack of cash. Normally, he'd save every cent he could, stretching it out for as long as possible. But today, he decided to treat himself to a hot meal. A real breakfast, not just a day-old sandwich from the convenience store. He walked a few blocks to a diner he used to go to years ago. The place hadn't changed much. The same neon sign buzzed over the door, and the smell of bacon and coffee greeted him as soon as he stepped in. Raymond took a seat at the counter, ordered eggs and toast, and sipped a steaming cup of coffee while he waited. As he sat there, the events of the previous night played over in his mind. He thought about how the man, David, had looked at him when the car finally started working again. There was something more than just gratitude in that look. Maybe it was surprise, or maybe even respect. It was the kind of look Raymond hadn't seen in a long time. By the time he finished breakfast, he felt a little more like himself. He left the diner and wandered back toward his usual spot. The streets were busier now, people rushing to work, cars honking at intersections. Raymond found his familiar spot on the curb and settled in, watching the world pass by. He didn't expect anything special to happen. After all, how many people actually follow through after a chance encounter? But as the morning turned into afternoon, he noticed something unusual. A sleek, black car pulled up to the curb not far from where he was sitting. The windows were tinted, but the license plate looked familiar. The door opened, and out stepped David Garrett. He wasn't wearing the fancy suit this time. Instead, he had on a casual jacket and sunglasses, looking less like a billionaire and more like a regular guy. He carried an envelope in one hand. Raymond was caught off guard. Why would someone like David come back here? David walked over, stopping just a few feet from Raymond. "Hey," he said, "I was hoping I'd find you here." Raymond stood up, unsure of what to say. Hi. What brings you back?" David held out the envelope. "I wanted to thank you. What you did last night, most people wouldn't have bothered. But you went out of your way to help me, and I appreciate that." Raymond took the envelope, his hands shaking slightly. He opened it slowly, not sure what to expect. Inside there was a note, a business card, and more cash than he'd ever held in his hands. He stared at it, speechless. "I know this won't fix everything," David said, "but I want to help. I own a few properties in the city. There's a small apartment that's currently empty. It's yours if you want it. No strings attached." Raymond looked up, still stunned. "You're giving me a place to live?" David nodded. "It's the least I can do. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And I believe in paying it forward." For the first time in years, Raymond felt tears well up in his eyes. He tried to say thank you, but the words got caught in his throat. David smiled. "Take it one step at a time," he said. "And if you need anything, you've got my card." With that, David turned and walked back to his car. Raymond watched him drive away, still holding the envelope tightly in his hand. Still stunned, Raymond sat back down. The envelope felt heavier now. He opened the note again and read it slowly. It wasn't just about the apartment or the money. The note said something that stuck with him. Sometimes it takes someone who's been through hard times to show the rest of us what kindness really looks like. You reminded me of that. Thank you. Raymond couldn't remember the last time someone said something like that to him. Most days, he felt invisible, just another face on the street, someone people avoided eye contact with. Now, for the first time in years, he felt seen. As the afternoon sun rose higher, Raymond started thinking about what to do next. The idea of having a real place to stay, a roof over his head, was almost too much to process. He thought about the other people he'd met at shelters, the ones who had helped him out when he had nothing. Maybe now he could help someone else. He decided to head to the apartment later that day. But first, he took a moment to just sit and reflect. The events of the past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. It all started with a simple act of kindness, helping a stranger with his car. And now, that small gesture had turned into something much bigger than he ever expected. Raymond knew his life wouldn't change overnight. There were still challenges ahead. But he also knew that this moment, this opportunity, was a turning point. It was a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can create a ripple effect. It reminded him that his story wasn't over yet. Raymond sat there, the weight of the envelope still sinking in. He hadn't even opened it completely yet. His fingers felt a little shaky, and his mind raced through 100 possibilities. What could this man, this billionaire, possibly have put inside? Whatever it was, it had to be more than Raymond had ever expected. As he carefully opened the envelope, the first thing he noticed was the crisp bills inside. Not just a few, but what looked like a significant amount. Enough to buy food for weeks, maybe months. Enough to buy new clothes, to find a real place to stay. He gently set the cash aside and pulled out the note. The words were written simply, in neat handwriting. Raymond, your act of kindness showed me something I'd forgotten. You didn't have to help me that night, but you did. I believe that people like you deserve a second chance, and I'd like to offer you one. The address below is for a small apartment I own. It's yours, rent-free, for as long as you need it. Inside, you'll find a set of keys and a contact number. Thank you again for reminding me that the best things in life don't come from money. They come from good people doing good things. Raymond's eyes scanned the page again and again. His mind struggled to accept that someone like him, someone who had spent years scraping by, could suddenly be offered a place to live, no strings attached. It felt surreal. He looked up from the note, holding it in one hand and the envelope in the other. Around him, the city went on as usual. People hurried past, oblivious to the man sitting on the curb. But inside, Raymond felt a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. "Is this real?" he murmured to himself. He glanced at the address on the note. It wasn't far from where he was sitting, just a few blocks away. His curiosity and disbelief pushed him to his feet. As Raymond approached the address, the doubts crept in. Was he walking into some kind of mistake? Had this been meant for someone else? But when he reached the building, a modest brick structure with clean windows, he found a small mailbox with his name on it. Inside the mailbox were keys, just as the note had promised. His hands shook as he unlocked the front door and stepped into a simple, clean apartment. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was warm, well lit, and fully furnished. There was even a small kitchen with a stocked pantry. Raymond stood there, overwhelmed. For so long he had been invisible, living on the streets where people barely acknowledged his existence. Now, someone had seen him, really seen him, and given him a chance. A safe place to sleep, a chance to start again. As he sat down on the small couch, Raymond thought about everything that had led to this moment. A man with everything, money, success, power, had been stranded on the side of the road. And a man with nothing had decided to help him, no questions asked. That simple act of kindness had changed everything. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, Raymond received a call from the billionaire's assistant. She said that David Garrett wanted to meet him again to discuss something important. When they met at a nearby cafe, David thanked him once more and then offered him an opportunity. "I have a small maintenance team for some of my properties," David explained. "I'd like you to join them. It's part-time for now, but I think you'd be a great fit." Raymond was stunned. Not only had he been given a place to live, but now he was being offered a job. A real job, where he could earn a steady income, rebuild his life, and move forward. "Why would you do this for me?" Raymond asked. David smiled. "Because you helped me without asking for anything in return. Because I see potential in you. And because I believe in second chances." It was more than just words. It was a new beginning. Raymond accepted the job, and over the following weeks, he started to settle into his new life. The money he earned allowed him to buy fresh clothes, to fix up the apartment a bit, and even to start saving. He found himself smiling more, feeling more confident, and walking through the city with his head held high. But what meant the most to him was the respect he now felt. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something. As Raymond began his new routine, he noticed a change in how people treated him. The cashier at the coffee shop started greeting him by name. Neighbors in the apartment complex waved and said hello. Even small interactions that had once felt cold and distant were now warm and welcoming. One day, as he returned from a shift, he bumped into an old friend from his factory days. The man did a double take. "Raymond, is that really you?" Raymond grinned. "It's me, all right." They talked for a while, catching up. His friend couldn't believe the transformation. "Man, you look like a new person." "What happened?" Raymond thought about it and said, "A little kindness. That's what happened." As word of his story spread, more people started reaching out. Local community groups asked him to speak at events. They wanted to hear how a small act of compassion had turned his life around. Raymond agreed, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted to show others that change was possible. He often thought back to that night on the roadside. He could have ignored the broken-down car. He could have kept walking. But instead, he stopped. He offered help. And that choice, one simple choice, set off a chain of events that brought him to where he was now. Raymond wasn't the same person he had been before. He had regained his confidence, his dignity, and his hope for the future. And as he looked around his modest apartment, now decorated with small personal touches, he felt grateful. Not just for the apartment or the job, but for the chance to start over. That night, as he sat on his couch, Raymond thought about what he wanted to do next. He wasn't content with just improving his own life. He wanted to give back. He started volunteering at shelters, sharing his story with others who were going through tough times. And each time, he ended with the same message. It only takes one small act of kindness to change everything. You never know whose life you might impact, or how it might come back to impact you. Raymond had barely settled into his new routine when he received another message from David Garrett's assistant. This time, the invitation was to meet at one of the luxury hotels downtown. Raymond didn't know what to expect, but something told him this wasn't just a casual check-in. When he arrived, he felt out of place among the marble floors and chandeliers. He wore his best clothes, recently purchased with the money he'd earned, but he still felt the weight of his past. As he approached the lobby desk, the receptionist greeted him politely and directed him to a private meeting room. Inside, David greeted him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. He looked relaxed, but there was an air of purpose in his demeanor. "I'm glad you came," David said. "There's something I need to share with you." Raymond sat down, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. David poured himself a glass of water, then leaned forward. You know, when we first met, I thought I was just some guy stuck on the side of the road, someone who had everything under control, just having a bad night. But that wasn't the whole truth. Raymond raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? David took a deep breath. I was on the way to an important meeting that night, a deal that would have sealed a billion-dollar partnership. But the truth is, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go through with it. For years, I've been building businesses, making money, expanding my influence. On paper, I had it all. But something was missing. Raymond listened quietly. He didn't know where this was going, but he could tell David was being genuine. That night, David continued, when you helped me without asking for anything in return, it made me realize something. I've spent so much time chasing success that I forgot what it meant to simply be a good person, to help someone just because it's the right thing to do. You reminded me of that. And it changed everything. Raymond didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as someone who could influence a man like David Garrett. But here was David, saying that Raymond's simple act of kindness had made him rethink his entire approach to life. I walked away from that deal, David said finally. It wasn't right for me, and it wasn't the kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. Instead, I started looking for ways to make a real difference, to invest in things that matter, things that help people. And I have you to thank for that. Raymond felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to being thanked, let alone by someone who seemed so untouchable. David smiled. And that's not all. I want you to be part of this new direction. I'm starting a foundation to help people who've been overlooked, people who just need a little help to get back on their feet. I want you to be on the advisory board. Your perspective, your experiences, they'll be invaluable. Raymond's eyes widened. You want me? On a board? Yes, David said without hesitation. You have something most people don't. A real understanding of what it means to struggle and what it means to rise above it. That insight is exactly what this foundation needs. Raymond nodded slowly, still trying to wrap his head around everything. I don't know much about foundations or boards, but if you think I can help, I'll do my best. David extended his hand again. That's all I'm asking for. Just do your best. Raymond shook his hand, feeling a strange combination of pride and disbelief. A week ago, he'd been living on the streets. Now, he was being asked to help shape a project that could change lives. As the meeting ended, David handed Raymond another envelope. This is just a small token to get you started, he said. And one more thing. Don't ever underestimate the value of what you bring to the table. You've already shown me how one small action can create a ripple effect. Keep doing that, and you'll help more people than you can imagine. Raymond left the hotel that day feeling like he'd just stepped into a new chapter of his life. He didn't fully understand how he had ended up here, but he knew one thing. Kindness matters. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that can spark the biggest changes. The following weeks brought even more surprises. As Raymond got involved in the foundation's work, he found himself speaking to groups of people, sharing his story. What had once been just a tale of struggle and survival was now an example of how compassion could turn a life around. He began to see how his own journey could inspire others. People in the community started reaching out, thanking him for showing them that even when life seemed impossible, there was always a chance for redemption. One afternoon, as he was helping the foundation distribute supplies to a local shelter, a young man approached him. The man looked nervous but determined. Mr. Raymond, I just wanted to say thank you. I read about what you did, and it reminded me to never give up. I was thinking about quitting my job and just giving up, but you showed me that even when everything seems lost, you can still turn it around." Raymond shook the man's hand, humbled. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "If I could help in any way, I'm glad. Just keep going, one step at a time." The man nodded and walked away, leaving Raymond standing there, amazed at how far he'd come. A year ago, he had been sitting on a curb, unsure of where his next meal would come from. Now he was helping others find their footing. David's words stuck with him. "Don't ever underestimate the value of what you bring to the table." Raymond realized he had been doing that for far too long. He had spent years feeling invisible, like his life didn't matter. But now he knew better. He knew that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could ripple out and touch more lives than he could ever imagine. And as he looked around at the people he was now helping, he couldn't help but smile. He had found his purpose. And it all started with one simple act on a cold night. From that moment on, Raymond's life began to change. At first, it was the little things. He started to walk taller, hold his head higher. When he spoke to people, he no longer looked down or away. He saw himself in a new light, not just as a man who had once struggled, but as someone who had been given a chance to make a difference. The apartment David had given him became a home. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a place where he could finally start thinking about the future. For the first time in years, Raymond began to feel what it was like to have stability. The simple act of having a roof over his head changed how he approached each day. Instead of waking up and wondering where he'd find his next meal, he could focus on what he could accomplish. As the weeks went by, Raymond found himself stepping into his new role at the foundation. It was a job that didn't feel like work. His official title might have been advisory board member, but in truth, he became the heart and soul of the organization. He met people from all walks of life, those who had been through the same struggles he had, and those who wanted to help. And every time he shared his story, something incredible happened. People listened. They weren't just hearing about his hardships. They were seeing how one small act of kindness could ripple outward. One day, while speaking to a group of volunteers, he said something that stuck with everyone in the room. "You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to show up. You need to be willing to help, even when you don't know how it'll turn out. That's what made the difference for me, and that's what can make the difference for someone else." That simple idea, just showing up, resonated. People started looking at him as more than just a board member. He became a mentor, a leader, someone who showed that change was possible. David Garrett, meanwhile, was proud of what he saw. He told Raymond once, "I started that foundation to help others, but I think you've taught me more than I've taught you." Raymond didn't feel like a teacher, but he did feel like someone who had finally found his place. The foundation grew, and so did Raymond's impact. With David's backing, they launched programs that helped people find jobs, secure housing, and rebuild their lives. Every step of the way, Raymond was there. He listened to their stories, offered words of encouragement, and showed them that it was possible to move forward. But it wasn't just the foundation that flourished. Raymond himself began to dream again. He thought about the future in a way he never had before. He imagined what it might be like to start a small business, to help even more people, to leave a legacy that would outlast him. Still, Raymond never forgot where he came from. He made a point to visit the neighborhoods he had once called home, to sit down with people who were still struggling, and to remind them that he understood what they were going through. "I've been there," he'd say. "I know how it feels to think no one sees you, But trust me, someone does, and things can change. Every now and then, he'd think back to that cold night on the side of the road. What if he hadn't stopped to help? What if he'd kept walking? It was a question he could never fully answer. But one thing was certain, that single moment of kindness had set everything else in motion. Raymond didn't see himself as a hero or a savior. He was just a man who had been given a chance, and who had decided to make the most of it. He often said, "It's not about what you have. It's about what you do with what you're given. And it's about lifting others up, because someone once lifted you." Over time, Raymond's name became well known in the community, not as a billionaire or a celebrity, but as someone who had truly made a difference. When people saw him, they saw hope. They saw what could happen when kindness met opportunity. As the foundation continued to grow, Raymond looked at the people around him, volunteers, donors, program participants, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Every one of them had their own story, their own struggles, their own triumphs, and together they were building something that would outlast all of them. One day, David called Raymond into his office. "I've been thinking," he said. "We've come a long way, but there's still so much more we can do. I'd like you to take the lead on our next project. I want you to run it." Raymond was stunned. "Me? Run it?" "Yes," David said. "You've earned it. You understand what people need, and you've shown that you know how to get things done. I trust you." It was a moment that Raymond would never forget. He agreed, not because he thought he was perfect for the role, but because he knew he'd give it everything he had. As the months turned into years, Raymond's influence only grew. He became a symbol of what could happen when someone believed in you. His story was told and retold, not just because of where he came from, but because of how far he had come. Through it all, Raymond remained humble. He always said, "This isn't just my story. It's everyone's story. It's about what happens when we help each other. It's about how one small act can change everything." And as he looked around the bustling office of the foundation, he realized that this wasn't just about him or even about David. It was about all the people they had reached, all the lives they had touched, and all the future stories that would start because of the work they had done together. Raymond often said that success wasn't about the size of your bank account or the number of accolades on your wall. It was about waking up each day knowing you'd made someone else's life a little better. That was his guiding principle now, and it was a lesson he wanted everyone to learn. With each passing year, Raymond continued to inspire those around him. His journey from a man struggling on the streets to a leader in his community was a reminder that no matter how dark life gets, there's always a way forward. All it takes is someone willing to give you a chance, and someone willing to make the most of it. And that's how a simple act of kindness changed everything. What started as one man helping another on a dark, lonely road ended up sparking a ripple effect that touched countless lives. Raymond's story isn't just his own. It's a reminder that everyone has the power to make a difference, no matter where they come from or what their circumstances are. Here's something for you to think about. Have you ever had a moment where you could help someone and hesitated? What would happen if, next time, you stepped up? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more inspiring content like this. And remember, the next time you're faced with a choice, choose kindness. You never know where it might lead. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.